Hello everybody and welcome back to Ant Holleufer. Today we'll be taking a look at HighTechAnts, the ant store. Now I have been using these products for 6 months now and I have been sponsored by them. I haven't been paid anything, I've just been given the products. But today is my honest review where I go pretty much from the start of the store to the end of the store, talking about everything that I have had in my storage and just my general opinions. So before we start the video, if you haven't joined the Holleufer family yet, go down and hit that subscribe button and hit that bell icon while you're at it to get notifications for every time I upload every Sunday. And with that all out of the way, let's start the HighTechAnts review. So like I said before, I have had HighTechAnts products for soon 6 months. I think I have had them for 5 months right now, and we're gonna start by talking about the nest. But before that, I have put timestamps all the way through, so if you have a specific topic you want to see, go down and see what topic it is you want to see, and you can just skip it there or you can hear it all. So there are 3 different versions of the different nest types. There is the 3D version with the plaster nest, there's the 3D version with the sponge, and we have the acrylic version with a sponge system. So I'm gonna start by talking about the 3D plaster and the 3D sponge version. And like the name suggests, it is the different types of hydration system. The sponge system is a regular sponge where you just put a pipette down or a little syringe and fill it up with water, whereas on the other side we have the plaster system. The plaster system is a little bit different. Within it is a little brick that you fill up with water, and the brick then absorbs the water and then gets the humidity out in the entire nest. So the plaster system is a system that I personally haven't seen much of compared to the normal sponge system, and I personally think the plaster both have its advantages and disadvantages. I'm really happy with how it works, the way you can pour water into it without really disturbing the ants. In more traditional sponge system, you often end up pushing the nest or does something that makes the nest vibrate a little, which can cause the ants to stress. And I haven't really seen this when I'm watering the plaster, just because this little hole that you put water into is just this little bit bigger, so you're putting the syringe down, you have a little bit of room before you hit the edges. It is also a lot easier to put water in the plaster and kind of see how much water there is, and then the water gets absorbed into the plaster. Whereas if you have the sponge system, I personally really struggle with putting the pipette down and watering and seeing how much water there is, because then it overflows and I don't really feel like I have watered the sponge at all, because I just feel like I put it down and then there comes water out. But that is just my personal struggles. And that is something I don't really have a problem with the plaster nest, because you have a big hole, you put the water in, you can see the water getting absorbed, and then you're good to go. And the last really good thing is that the plaster in general holds the humidity for way longer, as it is a big block rather than a small sponge. But with that all out of the way, I think we could go into the disadvantages of the plaster system. And as I just said, this big brick fills a lot in the nest. So in HighTechAnts founding nest and the small nest, I think the plaster block fits in really well with the design. It gives it a little bit of different levels, and the ants can sit and sip on the plaster. But when you get these larger medium nests, they start to look a little bit out of place with these small plaster bricks. And personally, I think they look great in the small founding nest and the small nest types. But when you go into the larger nest, it looks a little bit out of place. And that is because this brick is a big brick, whereas the sponges are a little bit smaller and are easier to hide away. And the second problem there is with the plaster nest is when you have had ants in there for a few months, a few weeks, however long time you have your ants inside, you move the ants out, you screw the nest apart and you start to clean it. Now, traditionally you can clean all nests pretty much all out so they are completely clean again. And you can also do this with the plaster nest. Except for the plaster brick itself. It can't really get cleaned if the ants have had dragged some, I don't know, debris or different insects over it. It just have this dirty tint after, and personally I haven't been able to remove this dirt. And now when I have my next colony move into this new nest, which isn't new but looks new, it doesn't look new because the plaster brick is still a little bit dirty from the old nest. Again, these are small things, but some people might think them as a big thing and some people don't really care. Personally, I don't really care. I just feel like whenever I move a new colony into this nest, I will say that it is a used nest, and that is why the plaster brick looks like it looks. And lastly, it is pretty bad if you overwater the plaster brick. It will both expand a little bit, which can pull the glass a little bit up, but also because it has the humidity in for a really long time. And in general, it is really important that you just don't overwater your plaster nest. Now, of course, you can also overwater the sponge, and like I said earlier, when you overwater the sponge, the water just kind of comes out and travels a little bit around, and you can just kind of clean it off. Whereas on the plaster system, it will have a really high humidity for a really long time. So that can of course be good, though it is recommended that you just slowly water them so the plaster don't overflow. And that is also why, if you were to choose between the plaster and the sponge system, it is a lot more beginner friendly to use the sponge system, because although you have to disturb the ants a little bit more when you are taking the syringe or the pipette down, it is easier not to overflow, and it is in general more beginner friendly. And that is also why you see the sponge system a lot more than the plaster system. But personally, I think it's really great that we're seeing these different systems, because I'm not that good with watering sponges. I mean, with the Mimicaruba colony, I water them when the humidity starts to go down, but immediately when I water them, the water comes up and out of the nest, so maybe I shouldn't water them yet. But again, I can see the humidity goes down, so I have to water them. And that is just a problem I don't really have with the plaster system. So which system should you go for, plaster or sponge? And I think it is really up to how you like your style. The plaster does feel a lot in the nest, whereas the sponge doesn't really feel that. It of course has a little place where it is, but the plaster feels a lot more. But then again, the plaster can hold the humidity for way longer. So if you are a person that doesn't look at your ants for 24/7, and it's a little bit better to use the plaster, because then you can just water it once a week instead of maybe twice a week. Personally, when I had to heat my nest, I had to water them twice a week. Whereas if I used the sponge system, I had to water them 3 to 4 times a week. So a massive difference on that point specifically. So with the plaster versus the sponge system all out of the way, let's talk a little about the acrylic sponge versus the 3D sponge nest types. Between the 3D sponge and the acrylic version, they are pretty similar, at least in the hydration system, both being a sponge system. The two nest types have completely different build styles, since the acrylic is several layers and the 3D is one solid block. A problem that can occur is if you overwater the acrylic version, because the water can seep into the different layers, and although this isn't bad, just don't do it too much. You may be able to see the dried water on the side of the acrylic walls, so therefore be a little bit careful when watering the acrylic nest, because the water may seep into the different acrylic layers. And to be honest, there isn't really much difference between the acrylic and the 3D version, except if you want to heat them, because the acrylic version has these small legs inbuilt in the nest, so you can right away put a heat cable under the nest. Whereas if you have a 3D plaster or a 3D sponge nest, you will have to manually screw on some small legs that you get with the nest to then raise the nest a little bit up. I think that is a great system, that you can decide whether you want the nest to stay up or down. I personally like the look of them being down and just using a heat mat rather than taking them up and going with a heat cable through. But of course it depends on what you like and how you will have to use the heat cable or heat mat to your other colonies. But I think it is great that you can choose whether you want the legs to be on or not. And with all that heat and humidity, we of course need a sensor to read the correct measurements. And this is where HighTechAnts have this amazing system that I personally really like. You have this little block that you can just kind of put into the nest with small magnets that just connects perfectly with a nice click. And then it just reads what the humidity is inside and the heat is inside. If you don't want to have this little sensor, you can just click it off and just put a little blank blocker you get with the nest. So if you're buying the nest without the sensor, you get the little blank block that you just click on. Or if you get the nest with the sensor, you get the sensor. What is really important to notice is that the 3D sensor doesn't click in with the acrylic nest. You have to get the acrylic nest with the acrylic sensor or the 3D nest with the 3D nest sensor. Although the sensor may look really similarly, they cannot click in on each other. They have to be specifically to the nest type. And that is something I personally didn't know when starting using HighTechAnts. But in general, I really like this magnet system because it just clicks in and works really well. And I don't really have anything bad to say with these sensors. They work like they should, and I'm quite happy with them, to be honest. I think they are really nice, both because they look nice, and if you don't like the look, click it off and put a blanket stopper instead. And to end the talk about the nest types, you can also get a red lid or a black lid to either make the nest a little bit see-through or not see-through at all. And with all of this nest talk out of the way, let's go into what HighTechAnts is maybe really known for, or at least I personally really like with them, their magnet system. Now, this magnet system is not unique to HighTechAnts, though I don't quite know who else uses it. I just know there are some other companies that use it. But the way this magnet system works is that with the small HighTechAnts connectors, there's a little magnet that you can just click in place. And then, well, the nest have a magnet and your tubing connector have a magnet, and when they click together really well. So in my first unboxing of the HighTechAnts starter kit, my reaction pretty much says it all. It's a fun system that works really well. It's a fun system to play with and functional in the same way. I have heard people say that the magnets can affect the ants' health, though as an apprentice electrician I know quite a lot about, well, magnet fields and stuff like that. And in my head, the magnets can't really affect the ants, and if they are affecting the ants, the heat mats and the heat cables we're using are way worse because, first of all, they use power, so the DC power makes the magnet fields way bigger and way worse, and therefore I can't really see why the small magnets in the HighTechAnts should do anything bad for the ants when we have these giant heat mats being powered up to make this magnet field even larger. But like I said before, the system as a whole works great for a setup. It's an easy way to switch around, and in my eyes the 4-way connector does it all. It works amazing and is great for future expansions. With the blocker set on the unused connection, it just works amazingly. If you have a nest connected with a 4-way connector, connected with an outworld, you have a really simple and nicely looking setup. If you then don't have room for a test tube in the outworld, well, the 4-way connector is perfect. You just unconnect one of the empty slots and connect the test tube holder and a test tube. In that way, you have your problem solved without the setup looking worse. And if you later have to expand to a new nest or something else, well, then you can just use the last empty slot to connect a tube going into a new 4-way connector and expand the system. And personally, I think it's a really nice system, though as a content creator slash ant YouTuber slash whatever I'm called, I have to move my nest from my ant table over to my recording place. And you could say, well, you don't have to do that. I really want to do it because I want my white background. And when I have to move this system, it works really well with just connecting and disconnecting, except if you have to move the nest a lot. Of course, if you are moving from one place to another, you can just stop all the connectors and just move them separately. But if you're like me and have to move it pretty often, you have to do it pretty carefully. I personally use a big blank plank where I just scoop the setup on and put it off, so therefore the ants don't really get that disturbed and I can move the whole system. This is a problem that not many people will face, but honest review, and these are my thoughts. Now with the magnet system done and dusted, let's talk about the final big thing of HighTechAnts, their outworlds. They have 3 different types of outworld. They have the mini, small and medium sized outworlds. Now the mini and the medium sized are pretty new, so I'm imagining in the near future that we'll have a large and maybe even extra large outworld on the list. Let's hope at least. The mini and the small outworld are pretty much exactly the same, one way in and the same way out. And the mini is just a smaller copy of the small outward. That's a confusing sentence. And then we have the medium outward, which is a little bit bigger and this time have 2 connections, so an entry and an exit or whatever you want to do. And personally, I like how the outward have these white pillars that kind of makes the whole setup look a little bit more sturdy, whereas other stores have these small screws that just screws the acrylic together. It's also a nice, but I personally like the look of the white walls because it just gives the setup a little bit more strength in my eyes. But of course, this is really up to what you like. Maybe you don't want any white in your outward, or maybe you like that it looks a little bit more sturdy as well. And lastly, we have the lid. The lid has some small ventilation holes, but when you have taken the lid out, it is where the magic happens. If the nest goes up here, you have this little upside down place where you can put fluon or anti-escape powder or whatever you use before the lid comes. And that is, of course, something that you see a lot of times in today's outworlds because they are amazing today, and that is great. But I also like how HighTechAnts does it because, well, you click on the lid in these 4 screw holes that are all the way around the sides, and it fits snug perfectly on. And well, when you take it off, the ants can't escape because they have to go upside down before getting out. At last, there are all the small accessories like the feeding dish. It's a small and simple form factor that works as it is intended. It is pretty much only for founding colonies with their founding outworlds, because when I personally use it, it can't really hold that much like if you have to feed a bigger colony, but it is perfect for small colonies where you just pop it in with whatever you want to feed them and pop it out and clean it, and then it's ready to use again. HighTechAnts also have other small accessories like heat cables and tubing and test tubes, of course. HighTechAnts also works together with Biformica and resells their liquid feeders, their fluon and their sunburst. At last, HighTechAnts also sells a few beginner-friendly species like Lacheus niger, Lacheus flavus, and that is pretty much a whole tour of everything HighTechAnts sells and what I think of it. I know, guys, it is a really heavy review, but first of all, I just haven't really had any problems with, well, the whole HighTechAnts system. The reason I have looked over there is because there is one of my nests over there. Of course, I have been sponsored by them in the past, but it doesn't really mean anything to me compared to what I'm saying. My biggest problem is, like I said earlier, when I have to move the setup around, because, well, the magnet system works well to click in and click out really easily, but not as well if you have to move the setup. And yeah, guys, that has been it for this video. Now, the good thing about HighTechAnts is that you can actually contact them and tell you what you don't like about their products, if there are any at least. And the good thing is also that with these smaller stores, not like small, but things often get improved over time, and most of the things are constantly getting improved. So please leave any comments below with things you maybe not like about HighTechAnts, and we can create a little discussion, and maybe we can get HighTechAnts in on the chat and he can answer some of the things that you may be having problems with. But else, Holleuffers, not guys, I'm too used to saying guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe, all of you, and I'll see all of you in another video. Bye!